Hey, how you doing? Thanks for having me. So yeah, I'm a data privacy professional and a privacy advocate. I consult for companies that are looking to build privacy plans, and I also consult with lawmakers. But I'm also a professor of legal and constitutional history. So I thought the best way to spend this call would be to take you guys on just a quick tour of the history of American privacy law, particularly how it relates to the Constitution and the ways that it's kind of changed to meet not just new technologies, but also just new historical moments in our society and in our culture. It's and eventually how it came to be recognized as a constitutional right. Just before I move forward, you guys can hear me okay?
I can hear you great. I'm
Okay, great.
looking in the chat and everybody, I see, Lawrence, I don't know if you can see the chat, but there's so much excitement, lots of
Cool.
exclamation points.
Thanks. My self-esteem is super high. So it's an interesting story. It's got an interesting cast of characters, and I think it's just good to know the history. Privacy is presently positioned as, one of the great social and political questions of the digital age. And you guys are working for a company that prioritizes privacy. And in that way, the work you guys are doing does mean you're operating at the vanguard of, that incredibly important question. For starters, it's important to know that the word privacy doesn't actually ever appear in the Constitution even once. But despite that fact, the Supreme Court, they have argued on a number of occasions that Americans do have a firmly established constitutional right to privacy. So how does that happen? How can you recognize a right when the word isn't even in the Constitution? Now, the big case where the court finally recognized the right to privacy, this has to do with not data protection or the media. It had to do with access to birth control and contraceptive devices. It's a landmark case. It's in 1965. It gets taught in law schools all the time. It's called Griswold versus Connecticut. And what's really cool about this case is that while the court is striking down an anti-contraception law in the name of privacy, it justified its ruling by leaning on a bunch of older privacy cases that had nothing to do with contraceptive or with reproductive rights. So what the court says in this case essentially is that the right to privacy is something that they construct. And the way they construct it is they lean on different aspects of a various amount of constitutional amendments that are in the Bill of Rights. The first one is free speech, which has to do with freedom of association, and we'll talk about that in a second. The Third Amendment, which is pretty blatant, it says soldiers aren't allowed to be quartered in people's houses. The Fourth Amendment, which protects people from unlawful searches and seizures. The Fifth Amendment, which is all about privacy, the right to just not answer any questions if you feel that it's going to incriminate you. And then the Ninth Amendment, which is also a tricky amendment that allows this kind of construction to happen in the first place. They look back at all these major cases. The cases are super interesting, and they speak to the different kinds of privacy flashpoints throughout our history. It deals with race relations, it deals with the rights of the accused, it deals with McCarthyism and anti-communism, and then also the women's movement and the sexual revolution. So I kind of want to take you through a tour of the big cases that dealt with these amendments, and then talk about how they were tied together in the reproductive rights struggle to create the first time ever a recognition that there's a constitutional right to privacy. So I'm going to start with the First Amendment. Now, the key First Amendment privacy case in our history has roots in the civil rights movement. It's 1958, the case is NAACP versus Alabama. So the First Amendment, among other things, it protects the right to free speech. But over time, major court decisions have helped that right evolve into a new right, into something that we call freedom of association. So if you take a look at the First Amendment real quick, it doesn't actually say anything about the freedom to associate with anyone. It just says that people have the right to assemble peacefully. So this case is the mid-1950s. The civil rights movement is really starting to pick up steam, and Alabama is this key battleground state. The Montgomery bus boycott's been won. Brown versus Board of Education has been decided. A lot of people are up in arms. And so segregationists in the Deep South, they start looking for any possible way they can to clamp down on the movement. But if you're a white supremacist in the Jim Crow South in the late 50s, you can't just pass a law on the books that says Black people aren't allowed to protest. It's something that'll get struck down. So what they try to do is make it as hard as possible to organize for the civil rights movement in Alabama. And what they do is they target the NAACP. In 1956, the Attorney General of Alabama, John Patterson, he files a lawsuit against the Alabama chapter of the NAACP on the grounds that they failed to meet the basic qualifications for doing business in the state. There's a law in the books at the time that said that all businesses operating in Alabama, they have to make a list of their members and their employees public to everyone else. NAACP pushed back and said, look, we're not a commercial business, we're a nonprofit, rights-based social and political organization, and that we're not going to turn over any records of our supporters or the people who work for us. The case goes to trial, after which the state judge who heard the case ordered the NAACP to produce all of their records that are relevant to their operations in Alabama, including the names and addresses of their members. If they didn't release the records, they would face a daily fine of $10,000, and that would eventually increase to $100,000 after a certain period of time. Now, the NAACP can't obey this order. They refuse to obey it. They see it for what it really is. This is an opportunity and an attempt to cripple their organization. Because if you deprive the NAACP of their privacy, of their organization's privacy, their members are going to be subject to various forms of harassment, and future members really might be dissuaded from joining or even donating money for fear of retaliation. It's not like every white person in the Jim Crow South is a white supremacist. A lot of people really supported civil rights, but it's one thing to support it and another to stand up and publicly say that you would. A lot of people quietly did, maybe some people donated money, but it's another thing to just stand up and have your name. The fear of retribution was pretty severe. So especially whites who were sympathetic to the movement at the time, this is something that could cripple the organization's effectiveness. So after some back and forth, the Supreme Court decides to hear the case, and they hand down the ruling in 1958. So the decision is unanimous. It's a 9-0 decision. Justice Harlan, he writes for the majority, and what he says is that we recognize a vital relationship between First Amendment speech and the freedom of association and the ability to do that in a certain level of privacy. He says that the members of the organization clearly face what he says economic reprisal, loss of employment, the threat of physical coercion, and other kinds of physical hostility. So with those outcomes being expected to recur, the court said that forcing the NAACP to just comply with the state's ruling would likely prevent its members from organizing and from advocating their beliefs. And so what he's saying is this is a First Amendment violation and that it has to do with privacy. Basically, he says, the court says that speech is protected by the First Amendment. Political association is a form of speech, and therefore freedom of association is protected by the First Amendment. But it didn't just protect association, it said you have a right to privacy in your political associations. Just like we kind of have the right to privacy in the voting booth, that you shouldn't have, who you voted for recorded on your register, just the fact that you did vote. It allows people to express themselves freely. It allows people to join organizations and agitate and push against the status quo. So this is the first main case that really deals with it. The First Amendment, NAACP, establishes a right to privacy in people's associations. On to the next piece of the privacy puzzle. This would be the Third Amendment. This one's pretty self-explanatory. It goes back to the American Revolution. The Brits were burdened by a considerable war debt from the French and Indian War. I don't know if you guys remember, like back in high school when they talked about this, but one of the things the Brits tried to do before the United States of America becomes a country is they start trying to station soldiers in the private homes of American citizens as a way to save money. Obviously, people have a huge problem with this, and this animosity lingers so long that even after the war is won, James Madison puts in the Bill of Rights 20 years later this push against having soldiers quartered in peacetime in people's houses. So there's never really been any significant challenge to this law. There was a labor dispute in the 80s over a prison strike. But ultimately, when you look at the Third Amendment, it's pretty clear that the framers thought that the idea of any government representative penetrating the privacy of the home and being stationed there was incredibly anathema to the idea of liberty and something that was really against the idea of just what it was to breathe free air in a free civilization. So you have the First Amendment association right. You have the Third Amendment against government agents being brought into people's homes, which then ultimately brings us to the Fourth Amendment. So this is the one that most seems to really deal with privacy. The Fourth Amendment protects you against unlawful searches and seizures from law enforcement into your house without them having a warrant. It says that before you can just invade someone's private domicile or their papers or their effects, that you have to go through these procedures and show probable cause and go to a judge. So the First Amendment association, Third Amendment association, the Fourth Amendment is probably the most blatant with terms of privacy rights. It deals with illegal searches and seizures, and there are two main cases that help expand the Fourth Amendment beyond the original text into the right to privacy. They both have to do with the wiretapping of phones and the history of surveillance technology in the 20th century. The first major landmark case to deal with wiretapping was in 1928. It's called Olmsted versus the United States. So Roy Olmsted is a bootlegger. He's a really, really, really good bootlegger, actually. His name is Big Boy Roy. And in the 1920s, he runs this pretty large operation out of Seattle that's smuggling Canadian booze by sea for distribution throughout the United States. Investigators estimated that the organization took in profits probably around like $2 million a year in 1928 dollars. And law enforcement agents, including the FBI, they used wiretaps installed outside of Olmsted's home to build a case, and they eventually resulted in the indictment of more than 70 people. You had everybody getting locked up for this. You have bookkeepers, you have secretaries, attorneys, salesmen, a number of corrupt Seattle cops. But the thing is, the agents never got a warrant before they installed the wiretap on which the entire conviction depended. And this left a window for Olmsted's lawyers to appeal on Fourth Amendment grounds. Again, they put in wiretaps right outside of his office where he's making these conversations. So this raises a couple of interesting questions for the court. Because if you look at the text of the Fourth Amendment, all it says is that you have the right to be secure in your houses, persons, papers, and effects. It doesn't say anything about non-physical or non-tangible ideas, but that makes sense. I mean, you couldn't even record sound when the founders write the Fourth Amendment. You couldn't even, come to terms with the idea of what personal data would look like, what wiretaps would look like, what, interception and the modern stuff we deal with now in modern surveillance, facial recognition. So the question that was brought before the court is, does the Fourth Amendment actually protect us in general in terms of our privacy, or is it just about physical trespasses? Are our communications, are our data also included in the spirit of the Fourth Amendment, even though it doesn't say it, or is this just about physical harms? Olmsted's attorney, he says that the police acquired evidence without a warrant. They didn't have a right to wiretap him, that the Fourth Amendment says they should, and so the search was illegal, and it constituted an illegal intrusion onto their home. But he's asking for a broad reading of the Fourth Amendment, and he wants to include the protections of all these activities that happen within the privacy of the home, including telephone calls. The way Olmsted sees it, because he made his calls from his house, he also believed that they were private. Therefore, law enforcement agents had intruded on his Fourth Amendment rights to be protected from unreasonable searches and seizures because they didn't get a warrant first. Now, the prosecutors disagreed. What the government argued is that the Fourth Amendment doesn't apply to telephones. It doesn't say anything about telephones. They also said that phone conversations aren't inherently private because every phone call involves actually at least three people: the caller, the called, and then also the phone company that's running the lines back and forth. They also said that they didn't need a warrant because they bugged Olmsted outside of his house. Therefore, no Fourth Amendment violation even existed. So Olmsted ends up losing. It's a really close call. It's a 5-4 decision. But the cool thing about the case is that no one really remembers the majority opinion. What people remember is the dissent. And the dissent in that case is written by Justice Louis Brandeis. He's one of the earliest and most influential scholars of American privacy law. Brandeis in the 1890s, when he was just out of Harvard Law School, he and his law partner at the time, they wrote a really famous Harvard Law Review called The Right to Privacy, which was this groundbreaking survey of privacy law. It was the first paper to ever say that privacy has to be beyond just property, that it has to deal with people's sensations and their emotions and their thoughts and what he calls their inviolate personality. Brandeis is on the court and he is livid at the decision. He understands the importance of the Constitution and that it has to keep pace with rapidly changing technology. And so what he says, the famous quote, is that someday ways can be developed where the government, without removing papers from drawers, can reproduce them in court. And so if you look at the quote, I mean, obviously Brandeis knows exactly what he's talking about. This is obviously what just continues to happen, especially from the 70s forward as our communications grow more sophisticated. And what he's saying is that the Fourth Amendment has to make space for this idea that it's not just about papers and your personal effects, it's your general right to privacy, that if it's a private sphere, if it's your home, if it's your personal property, there has to be a warrant before people can just go in and start snooping around. Now, that doesn't really help Olmsted, but Olmsted ends up working it out in the end. He gets pardoned in the mid-1930s, and the government gives him the equivalent of about $175,000. Brandeis's Olmsted dissent, that's the one that remains one of the most widely read pieces of legal writing in American history. And then generations later, a very different Supreme Court, they borrow heavily from those arguments when they finally extend Fourth Amendment protections to wiretapping. So The Olmsted reading of the Fourth Amendment, this ends up being overturned 40 years later in a case called Katz versus the United States. This time it's not a bootlegger, it's a bookmaker. Charlie Katz is the name of the bookie. The FBI realizes that he's running this nationwide illegal gambling operation out of LA. And FBI agents constantly observed him using this public payphone, which they thought he was using to relay booking information throughout the country. They arrest him. They wiretap the public payphone, they get his information, but in 1967, they challenge on Fourth Amendment grounds to the Supreme Court. They say that it was an illegal wiretap, and this is a new court. It's the Warren Court, and it's one of the most liberal and rights-expanding courts in our history. And with a 7-1 vote, the court overturns Olmsted's case and ends up overturning Katz's conviction along with it. Now, the justice at the time, he says, Justice Potter Stewart, that the Fourth Amendment is meant to protect people, not places, and that it's not just about the privacy of your own home, it's about anybody that has a reasonable expectation of privacy. Now, this is now the current basis for pretty much all federal privacy law in America in terms of criminal prosecution. It doesn't have to do with whether your house was penetrated. Whether or not a cop needs to get a warrant is basically established around this. Did you have a reasonable expectation of privacy? When you guys deal with any potential lawsuits or data protection, and when you start speaking to people about what it is that you do, this is the gold standard. If your clients have a reasonable expectation of privacy, then their privacy is protected by the Fourth Amendment. If your clients give consent to have certain amounts of privacy taken away from them, then they don't have that reasonable expectation. But this is the standard. When people say my privacy rights were violated and they go to court, most judges, this will be the first thing that they ask. Did they have a reasonable expectation? Is that expectation something that's in line with our present day? And then from there, they'll make a decision. So again, the First Amendment with freedom of association and privacy, the Third Amendment against soldiers being quartered in your house, the Fourth Amendment talking about protecting people, not places, and having a reasonable expectation of privacy that extends beyond the home. This goes to the Fifth Amendment. Now, the Fifth Amendment has kind of pop culture presence, the right to remain silent. If you don't remain silent, anything you say. But as Americans, we have the right to refuse to answer questions regardless of how seemingly innocent they are. Basically, every advanced democracy has some kind of version of this law. It dates back to the beginning of the English legal tradition. It's even recognized now in the bylaws of the United Nations. The Fifth Amendment has a really rich history. It covers a lot of cases that I'm not going to discuss at length here for time, but I do want to call attention to the role of the Fifth Amendment in the early 1950s when it was tested by the height of McCarthyism, and that's during the Second Red Scare. I don't know if you guys have heard about it, but HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, the 50s with Joe McCarthy, a lot of people call them witch hunts. Arthur Miller wrote The Crucible as an allegory for that. Now, as more and more individuals were being called to testify before the House and the Senate when they were searching for communists, more and more people started seeing the whole thing as just a smear campaign that was motivated by political opportunism, trying to just attack political opponents. And so people started insulating themselves from questions by taking the Fifth Amendment. Even on seemingly innocuous questions like where do you live or are you married, people just refused to speak with Congress. So in response, Congress started making this series of attempts to fine individuals for taking the Fifth and not answering even basic questions. They challenged it in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court weighed in, and in 2 different cases, they basically upheld the right to remain silent, even on small questions. And so Americans, even if it's not asking about criminality, Americans have the right to simply refuse to ask questions because, who knows, it's called the links in the chain, that anything you say may eventually lead to some criminal accusation. And so you have this blanket protection where you can just remain silent if you don't want to talk about it. Okay, so we're good. We have our constitutional zones of privacy, and we can talk about the big case now. The first, the third, the fourth, and the fifth, and they all get tied together in that big case, Griswold versus Connecticut. Now, in the 1960s in Connecticut, there's this law on the books which prohibited the use of any drug or any article or instrument that would help with birth control. So condoms are illegal, vaginal foam is illegal, spermicidal lubricant is illegal. The use or the giving out or sale of anything that can be used for birth control is blatantly against the state law. It also declared that anybody who assists, counsels, causes, hires, or commands someone else to use these forms of birth control can be prosecuted and punished as if you were the principal offender. Again, this is the early 1960s. Second wave feminism is really picking up steam, and this law understandably becomes a main target for women's rights groups, particularly Planned Parenthood. Now, there are two issues at play here. The first issue is that access to contraception is a cornerstone of the women's movement, and it had been since the late 19th century. Particularly the work of Margaret Sanger is most popular with this. Preventing unwanted pregnancy was seen by most progressive women's groups as a path to economic mobility and also as a way to assert your individual sexual identity, that women, just like men, enjoy sex, are sexual beings, and should have the freedom to go out and enjoy sex and express themselves and explore themselves sexually without fear of unwanted pregnancy. And so there's this issue of freedom and liberty tied to contraception. I'm not even talking about abortion law, I'm just talking about access to birth control. So that's the first issue. The second is that there's a distinct kind of class bias in the law. It's not like no one in the 1960s in Connecticut is using birth control. It's just that middle class women and upper class women, they're able to get birth control from private physicians. And that's not something that really cops are breaking down doors and stopping. But it's poor women that need to get them from clinics. And clinics have a hard time handing this stuff out because they are subject to prosecution. So these laws are really just taking away rights from poor women who go to clinics and not really from middle and upper class women. So Planned Parenthood, their Connecticut branch, intentionally and very publicly defy the law, start giving out contraceptive advice to married couples, and they basically defy the law and ask themselves to get arrested. They try to get themselves arrested so they can challenge the law. The clinic's executive director is Estelle Griswold, and her partner is Dr. Buxton, who's a medical director and who's a professor at Yale Medical School. They're both arrested, they're tried, and they're convicted of giving information, instruction, and medical advice about birth control to married people. They knew the case was going to go to trial, so they were very smart, and they made sure that they were only giving contraception to married people so that they could challenge that in court. And so they appeal it to the Supreme Court, and their argument is rooted in the right to privacy. They said that access to contraception, access to birth control, particularly for married couples, wasn't about right or wrong. It was about limited government, that it was none of the state's business, that this is too sacred a sphere for the government to regulate on. The idea that the government could come in and tell a husband and wife how they could have sex, what they can and can't use when they have sex, particularly if a wife had a couple of kids and was told by a physician that if she got pregnant again, there could be medical issues and complications that would be detrimental to her health, that it was no business of the government to ever regulate on this, right or wrong aside, that this was an issue of privacy. Either we're Americans and we believe in limited government to a degree, or we don't. The court absolutely agreed. It was a 7-2 vote. It's a landmark case. That's Estelle Griswold on the left. The court says that they recognized a basic right to privacy, one that lived in the Constitution, one that was in the First Amendment, the Third Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, and the Fifth Amendment. And the Ninth Amendment, for those of you who don't know, if you're not looking at the Bill of Rights, what the Ninth Amendment says is essentially, just because we haven't written something down in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights doesn't mean that can be used as an excuse to deny Americans essential rights down the line. This was basically James Madison being afraid that just because he forgot to include something, that some tyrant down the road would say, oh, well, it's not in the Constitution, so you don't have this right. Madison believed that freedom wasn't born in 1776. There are higher truths. And so he installed the Ninth Amendment basically as a safeguard against that argument that said, just because we didn't list something here doesn't mean you can use as an excuse to take away people's fundamental rights, that the Constitution doesn't give people rights, that it recognizes those rights. And so with the Ninth Amendment, the justices are allowed to construct this constitutional right to privacy. And it's the first time in American legal history that the Supreme Court says a right to privacy exist in the Constitution, that there are zones of privacy, and they involve the relationship created by several fundamental Constitution guarantees that the state had no right to invade. So to justify this, the justices, particularly Justice Douglas and Justice Goldberg, they point to the Ninth Amendment, and that's how the constitutional right to privacy gets recognized. But what I want you to understand too is that the right to privacy isn't just about reproductive rights and Griswold versus Connecticut. Before you can get there, you have all these interesting little flashpoints in American history that have so much to do with our society and our culture that has nothing to do with reproductive rights. The First Amendment case, that's about civil rights and the great racial struggles that we had in the mid 20th century that still extend to our modern discussions. The Third Amendment harkens back to the pre-revolutionary days and what we consider to be a tyrannous and just illegal exercise of a king's power. The Fourth Amendment, that has to do with the history of technology and whether or not the Constitution can evolve to new standards of tech and new ways that people communicate because of this. And does the Fourth Amendment apply to this, or do we need a whole new amendment? The Fifth Amendment deals with anti-communism and basics of civil rights in terms of your relationship with the state, to not get railroaded and have your entire professional career destroyed simply because somebody's holding up an envelope that says you're a communist without any proof. And then the Ninth Amendment is the sexual revolution and second wave feminism and all those exciting things that happened in the 1960s in terms of securing equal rights for women and all of the things that snowball out after that. So privacy is a very interesting part of American history, of American legal history. And the key cases in it are this kind of just beautiful spectrum of all the things and all of the great debates and kind of just struggles that we face and have faced and continue to face. And they're very, very different from stuff like Cambridge Analytica right now, or a lot of the main centerpieces of the debate. But it's important to know moving forward that the Constitution is very flexible on these things, and that it does seem equipped to deal with a lot of our more complicated and modern questions, that they've faced modern questions before, complicated questions before, and found creative solutions to protect what the court regarded kind of as a fundamental right. If you're at all interested in this, this is a very small part of what I covered in my book. A lot of what I do in my book is I use the legal history of privacy as a window to kind of look at the broader story of American history. And if any of you guys have any questions about this, then, by all means, I'm around.
Elena hasn't actually given me permission, but I'm talking anyway.
Okay.
Lawrence, thank you for that talk. That was really just absolutely incredibly interesting and very cogent also.
Thanks.
I wanted to ask you a question. So given the context that we're coming from in the cryptocurrency world, there's this very different approach to privacy, which is all about much more focused on really data access and also obfuscating data. And I'm curious, I don't know if you have any exposure to this cypherpunk conception of privacy, but I'm curious what you think of, given that the Constitution is so reliant on interpretation and on the good judgment of everyone who ends up involved in the interpretation, do you feel like that's a vulnerability, or do you think that the checks and balances that are part of our government are sufficient, and that's how we've managed to sort of cobble together this constitutional protection? Maybe you'd even object to me saying cobbling together. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Oh, I agree. One of the big, like the first chapter of the book that I wrote was like on the history of data protection and stuff like that. I think one of the reasons Elena asked me to talk about this too is that so it could be something that was just a little bit different than what you guys talk about in a lot. But yeah, I guess to answer your question, it's both good and bad. I think it's good in that even though basically none of this has to do with data privacy and the current issues facing data, it definitely does at least indicate that someone who's a privacy advocate can stand up in front of a group of lawmakers and be like, look, this has been recognized by a bunch of different courts for, over the span of like a century as this kind of fundamental aspect of who we are. And it wasn't just liberals or conservatives doing it, because privacy is something that, depending on how you package it, totally appeals to liberals and conservatives at the same time. I think the main issues now, though, it's going to be not constitutional protections, but it's about getting federal omnibus protections in. We need something that's comprehensive, something like you see in Europe. And so it wouldn't be a constitutional question, I think, so much as just this idea of, coming up with just a comprehensive single, not, like you said, cobbled together. I mean, privacy law right now on data protection is all about being cobbled together, right? It's a state by state kind of law. And then a state like California does something and then everyone kind of ripples out, but doesn't know how to respond. And so I think federal law is where the main future for this is happening. But what's interesting is a lot of this stuff was about achieving privacy by telling the government to kind of stay away. Whereas now it seems like the only way we're actually going to have meaningful privacy protections is by actually having the government be the one to give them to us, right? That like instilling this, like, you know, these series of penalties and laws where if companies violate those laws and are in breach of their privacy contracts, that there are severe penalties to be paid and things like that. So I think that's one of the big kind of differences between the early debates over it and then the modern debate over privacy law now.
Awesome. Lawrence, I want to thank you again for this just really comprehensive lecture. I feel like I went back to undergrad.
Thanks.
So I'm looking at the clock. We have about 7 minutes left, and there's just lots of comments in the chat. People were super active. I'm going to try to go through them one by one and give you a chance to answer them. Sure. But one person asked, is there any satisfying positive definition of privacy that's strong enough, in your opinion, to capture all of these contemporary cases? Yeah, and just a little bit more color, like our ECC's founder and CEO, Zuko, he puts a lot of emphasis on privacy as a way for consent. So privacy is you being able to consent to who has access to your information. But I don't know if that's something that you, if you have your kind of like favorite definition of privacy. And then I have like 15 other questions for you.
Yeah, no problem. Did I stop my screen sharing?
You did.
Okay, just give me 1 second, sorry. By far, the best guy to talk to, or best guy to read about this, is this guy, Daniel Solove, Solove. He wrote a book called Understanding Privacy, which is kind of explains why it's so hard to define, and then he comes up with this great taxonomy. So Brandeis in the 1890s, what he says about privacy is that it's the right to be left alone. That essentially, that's what it is. That's a very broad and imperfect definition. The best definition that I've ever heard came from this lawyer at Columbia named Alan Weston. And what he said is that privacy is the right to control what information and access people have about you, and your right to basically determine what information and what access people have. That's not the perfect definition, but it's the one that I would go with when trying to kind of start the conversation, that it's about limiting access and controlling information. But defining it and then explaining why it's important, I think, are two different things. For data protection, I'd say the best reason that privacy is important is because privacy gives you a control over your self-narrative. Like, you know, you have the right to shape people's perceptions about you. Not entirely. I mean, people are going to think what they're going to think, but we control the information we share with other people and what we put out into the world, largely because we want to have some say in how we're perceived. The stuff that I would tell to my friends aren't the same that I would to my employers, which aren't the same that I would to a romantic partner. And we kind of pick and choose because we want to shape those perceptions. If we lose control of our data, if we lose control of our information, it means that we also lose control over that we're no longer the author of our own self-narrative, and that, that's problematic in a lot of ways.
Nice. So another question that I had when listening to your lecture is, this focuses on kind of the history of privacy from a US legal perspective. I wonder, like, if you hadn't focused all of your research on the US, what other countries have interesting histories of privacy that either mirror ours or like are stand in complete contrast to ours?
Well, the book, I try to do the book I'd say is like 30% legal, and then the rest is kind of like a social and cultural history. But the other countries that would definitely say, I mean, the European GDPR is the way to go. Right now, I'd say Germany in particular is a country that's fascinating in terms of their privacy rights. I mean, the first thing they do, they have that binary that you usually see a lot with WikiLeaks, which is that idea of they culturally believe in absolute privacy for the individual and then absolute transparency for the institutions. Like, so when they, tear down the Reichstag and they build up the new Capitol building, it's made out of glass with this kind of symbolism that the public can look inside, that unlike the Nazis, there would be no more secret meetings and things like that. And it would make sense that Germany has this view on privacy, especially given its history in the 20th century. Germany under fascism and then under the Soviet regime is very, I think Germans are very in touch with the ways information can be used against people and the ways in which information can be used to perpetuate intolerance and inequality and, you know, a kind of large amount of tyrannical control. And so after the wall comes down, Germany ends up kind of in this new generation, very, very proactive in terms of privacy rules and regulations. So that's something that I would think about. There's a general cultural and social knee-jerk reaction to privacy problems in Germany that I think burns a little brighter and comes across a little more palpable than you see in a lot of other Western European or American countries.
Nice.
I'd say that right now, China in particular, with anti-protest culture, shows the exact opposite end of the spectrum, like a wholehearted embracing of facial recognition software, you know, massive control over just transportation and communications networks. China is, I think, the perfect example of what a present-day cautionary tale looks like and why these things need to be, you know, checked and regarded constantly. But I can't stress enough, like the American thing, privacy is one of these issues that it's just, you know, in these times of polarization and protest, like you can really package to both sides. And it's something that is one of the few issues that really does seem to me to have the potential for bipartisan support, and something that, you know, both sides really do tend to care about a lot, just for different reasons and in different ways.
Agreed. Yeah. And another country that I've been following closely is India. If you guys are on the weekly forums, you'll see I post every so often a link to those stories. They are they're in discussion for a GDPR-like privacy law for the entire country of India, which has one of the highest populations on earth. And yet, while the law is very stringent for privacy expectations and privacy protections that private companies need to protect, it also, on the other hand, is a complete, like, carte blanche backdoor for governments to have access. So the Indian government must be able to have access to all of the tech tools and tech that happens in India. So that, to me, is a really fascinating story. We are at time. We're right at 2:00. And Lawrence, I just want to thank you again for kicking off this new tradition that we're doing in Zcash, which is these monthly community calls. We did not get to all of the questions in the forum. I'm happy to squeeze in one more if people want to stay a little bit later, or send you these questions via email, and then I can take your answers and post them in the forum. I want to be respectful of everybody's time, but so far I'd say this was a big success. I don't want to count my chickens before they hatch, but it seems like everybody enjoyed it.
If I could just say one thing, you and I talked about this earlier on our phone call, but I just think it's relevant for everyone at Zcash. So the thing with data, you know, my faith in the law isn't absolute, and I'm kind of a cynic when it comes to politics and legal stuff, even though it's, you know, what I do for a living. And if you're feeling cynical about the potential for lawmakers to actually do the right thing, one thing that you might find some comfort in is the fact that since the 60s and 70s, one of the reasons privacy always gets its ass kicked in American legal discourse and political discourse is because privacy is expensive for special interests. It's expensive for companies. It makes them have to lose money and hire compliance officers, and exposes them to lawsuits and stuff like that. And so a lot of companies didn't really care about privacy because it was going to hurt their bottom line. What's really cool about the 21st century is that it seems that people care about their privacy enough now to pay for it. And companies like yours, the Apple ad campaigns about privacy, I'm not saying Apple's the best with your privacy, but the fact is they view it as a commodity now. And people are so concerned about their privacy that it seems like they're willing to pay for it. I mean, it's one of the premises based on your entire company. And so I find that to be really exciting, because it's the first time in history that it seems like the profit motive is now also on the side of privacy. It'll definitely still be on the side of people who want to invade it. That's never going to change. But it seems to me like the scales are starting to be a little more balanced. And I think in a lot of ways, you guys are part of that movement. And so if you can still not trust lawmakers to do the right thing, and privacy still has a heartbeat in the digital age, I think largely because it now seems to be something that's being commodified and something that people tend to care about.
Right on. I think that is, we couldn't have asked for a better message to end on. Privacy is important, and people are finally coming around to caring about it. Lawrence, thank you again for joining us, and to everybody who participated in the chat and just joined with Zoom, thank you for coming, and then we'll see you next month for February's Zeal call. You'll get an email from me with more information, but yeah. Oh, also, I said this at the beginning of the call, but happy International Privacy Day, everyone. Yay.
Yay.
Yay. Okay, so have a good week, be good, and 2 big wins today. The Zcash Community Dev Fund has, those results are in, and then our first inaugural Zeal call has been a great success. So thanks everyone for all your help with that.
Thanks.
All right, bye.
Bye.